They had seen it happen too many times to doubt it anymore. Across the battlefields of Europe, from the wide-open plains of the Eastern Front to the hedgerows of Normandy, German tank crews watched enemy armor burn before it could even fight back. To them, it wasn't luck. It wasn't even superior tactics. It was simply the natural order of the battlefield. When a tiger appeared, the outcome was already decided. By late 1942, the arrival of the Tiger I had fundamentally changed armored warfare. Its thick frontal armor, up to 100 millimeters, was something most Allied guns simply could not penetrate at normal combat ranges. Even more decisive was its 88mm KWK-36 gun, a weapon that had already earned a deadly reputation in its anti-aircraft role. Mounted on a tank, it became something far more terrifying. It could destroy enemy armor at distances where return fire was not just ineffective, it was impossible. German crews quickly understood what this meant. Engagements were no longer about maneuvering into position or trading blows at close range. They became controlled executions. A Tiger could sit at over a kilometer away, identify targets through high-quality optics, and eliminate them one by one. American Shermans, British Churchills, Soviet T-34s, it didn't seem to matter. They all burned the same way. The numbers tell part of the story, but the experience tells the rest. Reports from Allied crews repeatedly described the same pattern. Tanks knocked out before they even realized they were under fire, shells bouncing harmlessly off German armor, entire formations forced to withdraw after just a few minutes of contact. In North Africa, in Italy, and later in France, the psychological effect of facing German heavy armor began to spread faster than the tanks themselves. For German tankers, this created something rare in war, confidence that bordered on certainty. Veteran crews didn't just believe they had better machines, they believed they were untouchable. Their training reinforced it. German armor doctrine emphasized long-range engagement, coordinated fire, and careful positioning. Combined with superior optics and communication systems, it allowed them to dictate the terms of every fight. A Tiger commander didn't need to rush forward. He didn't need to take unnecessary risks. He could observe, calculate, and strike from a position of overwhelming advantage. And more often than not, the enemy would be destroyed before they could even respond. Meanwhile, on the other side, American crews were fighting a very different war. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of U.S. armored forces, had been designed with a completely different philosophy in mind. It prioritized mobility, mechanical reliability, and ease of production over heavy armor and large-caliber guns. In many situations, this made it an effective and versatile tank, but against German heavy armor, those advantages often meant very little. The Sherman's standard 75mm gun struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger, even at close range. Crews were taught to aim for the sides or rear, but getting into those positions required maneuvering under fire from a gun that could destroy them in a single shot. It was a deadly equation. To win, they had to close the distance, but closing the distance often meant being destroyed before they got the chance. This imbalance shaped the battlefield in ways that went beyond simple statistics. It changed how soldiers thought, how they moved, and how they fought. Allied tankers learned to rely on numbers, coordination, and air support. A single Sherman might not stand a chance against a Tiger, but a group of them, working together, could overwhelm even the most powerful German tank. At least, that was the theory. In practice, it came at a cost. Multiple tanks lost to destroy a single enemy vehicle. Crews sent into engagements knowing the odds were against them. Stories spread quickly of Tigers knocking out 4, 5, even 10 enemy tanks in a single encounter. Whether every detail was accurate didn't matter. The effect was real. The Tiger became more than just a tank. It became a symbol. For German tankers, that symbol worked in their favor. It reinforced their belief that they were the elite, the decisive force on the battlefield.
Many of them were experienced veterans, having fought for years on multiple fronts. They trusted their machines, their training, and each other. When they moved into position, they expected to win, and most of the time they did. But confidence in war is a fragile thing. It is built slowly through repeated success, and it can feel unshakable right until the moment it is tested by something new. By 1944, small signs were beginning to appear that the balance was not as permanent as it seemed. Allied forces were adapting, new tactics were being developed, new weapons were being introduced. Still, for the German tankers inside their steel giants, those changes were easy to dismiss. They had seen new Allied equipment before, and it had not changed the outcome. They had faced larger numbers, heavier attacks, and more aggressive tactics, and each time they had held their ground. So when rumors began to circulate about a new American tank, something heavier, something different, most crews didn't take it seriously. They had no reason to. From their perspective, the equation had already been solved. Their armor was too strong, their gun was too powerful, their experience was too great. They faced everything the Allies could throw at them, and they were still standing. That belief, more than any technical specification or battlefield report, defined the mindset of German tank crews at the height of their power. It was the reason they could engage without hesitation, hold positions under pressure, and fight with a level of confidence that few opponents could match. But it was also the reason they were unprepared for what was coming next. Because for the first time since the Tiger had entered the war, the Allies were about to field a tank that didn't need to rely on numbers or luck to survive. A tank that could stand at range, return fire, and win. And when that moment came, the laughter would stop.
By the time American forces fully understood what they were up against, the pattern was already impossible to ignore. Reports from North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front all pointed to the same conclusion. Whenever German heavy tanks entered the battlefield, the balance shifted instantly. It didn't matter how many Shermans were available or how well the crews were trained, something fundamental was missing. At first, the problem wasn't seen as a failure of design. American armored doctrine had been built on speed, reliability, and mass production. The idea was simple: win not by building the heaviest tank, but by building enough good ones, moving them faster, and supporting them with artillery and air power. In theory, this approach made sense. In practice, it worked, until it didn't. Encounters with German Tigers and Panthers exposed the limits of that thinking. Tank crews began reporting that their shells were bouncing off enemy armor, even at ranges where they should have been effective. Commanders noticed that engagements were being decided before they could even maneuver. The battlefield had changed, but the American response had not yet caught up. The M4 Sherman, for all its strengths, had been designed under assumptions that no longer held true. Its armor was sufficient against earlier German tanks, but not against the high-velocity guns now appearing in increasing numbers. Its main gun was versatile, effective against infantry and lighter vehicles, but struggled against the thick frontal armor of the Tiger. Crews were trained to adapt, to flank, to coordinate, to outnumber, but adaptation has limits when the gap in firepower and protection becomes too wide. Inside the U.S. Army, debates began to intensify. Some commanders argued that tanks were not meant to fight other tanks directly. That role, they insisted, belonged to tank destroyers, specialized units designed to hunt enemy armor. According to this doctrine, Shermans were supposed to exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, and avoid direct confrontations with heavy tanks whenever possible. But war rarely follows doctrine. On the ground, Sherman crews didn't have the luxury of choosing their battles. When a Tiger appeared, there was no time to call in a separate unit or reorganize the battlefield. They had to fight with what they had. And too often, that meant facing an opponent they couldn't reliably defeat head-on. The consequences were measured not just in lost vehicles, but in lost confidence. Crews adapted as best they could, using terrain, coordinating attacks,
calling in air support, but each engagement reinforced the same lesson. The enemy had a technical advantage, and it was costing lives. Behind the front lines, American engineers and planners were already working on solutions. Even before the Tiger had made its full impact, there had been discussions about developing a heavier tank, something with thicker armor and a more powerful gun. Early prototypes like the T-20 and T-23 series explored new designs, new transmissions, and improved firepower. But development was slow, and priorities were divided. One of the biggest challenges was not just engineering, it was decision-making. The United States was producing thousands of Shermans every month. Factories were optimized, supply chains were established, and crews were trained around a system that worked on a large scale. Introducing a completely new tank meant disrupting that system. It meant delays, retraining, and logistical complications in the middle of a global war. So the question became more complicated than simply building a better tank. It became a question of timing. Was it worth slowing down production to introduce something new? Or was it better to continue with what already worked, even if it meant accepting higher losses in certain situations? For a time, the answer leaned toward caution. Incremental improvements were made instead. New versions of the Sherman were equipped with better guns, such as the 76mm, which offered improved performance against German armor. British forces introduced the Firefly, mounting a powerful 17-pounder gun onto the Sherman chassis. These changes helped, but they didn't fully close the gap. Meanwhile, German tank development continued to push forward. The Panther, with its sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm gun, added another layer of complexity to the battlefield. It was faster and in many ways more versatile than the Tiger, while still retaining deadly firepower. For Allied crews, this meant that the problem wasn't just one tank, it was an entire generation of enemy vehicles that outmatched them in key areas. By 1944, the pressure to respond had become impossible to ignore. Combat reports were clear. Field commanders were asking for something that could stand toe-to-toe with German heavy tanks, not just outmaneuver them or overwhelm them with numbers. They needed a tank that could fight on equal terms and win. And the result of that effort was a design that had been evolving quietly in the background. It would eventually become known as the M26 Pershing. Unlike the Sherman, it was built with a different philosophy in mind. It had thicker armor, a more powerful 90mm gun, and a silhouette that reflected lessons learned from years of combat. It was not just an upgrade, it was a shift. But getting that tank from design to battlefield was not immediate. There were delays in testing, disagreements over specifications, and ongoing concerns about reliability and production. Some commanders questioned whether it was necessary. Others argued that it was already too late. So the question became more complicated than simply building a better tank. It became a question of timing. Was it worth slowing down production to introduce something new? Or was it better to continue with what already worked, even if it meant accepting higher losses in certain situations? For a time, the answer leaned toward caution. Incremental improvements were made instead. New versions of the Sherman were equipped with better guns, such as the 76mm, which offered improved performance against German armor. British forces introduced the Firefly, mounting a powerful 17-pounder gun onto the Sherman chassis. These changes helped, but they didn't fully close the gap. Meanwhile, German tank development continued to push forward. The Panther, with its sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm gun, added another layer of complexity to the battlefield. It was faster and in many ways more versatile than the Tiger, while still retaining deadly firepower. For Allied crews, this meant that the problem wasn't just one tank, it was an entire generation of enemy vehicles that outmatched them in key areas. By 1944, the pressure to respond had become impossible to ignore. Combat reports were clear. Field commanders were asking for something that could stand toe-to-toe with German heavy tanks, not just outmaneuver them or overwhelm them with numbers. They needed a tank that could fight on equal terms and win. And the result of that effort was a design that had been evolving quietly in the background. It would eventually become known as the M26 Pershing. Unlike the Sherman, it was built with a different philosophy in mind. It had thicker armor, a more powerful 90mm gun, and a silhouette that reflected lessons learned from years of combat. It was not just an upgrade, it was a shift. But getting that tank from design to battlefield was not immediate. There were delays in testing, disagreements over specifications, and ongoing concerns about reliability and production. Some commanders questioned whether it was necessary. Others argued that it was already too late. So the question became more complicated than simply building a better tank. It became a question of timing. Was it worth slowing down production to introduce something new? Or was it better to continue with what already worked, even if it meant accepting higher losses in certain situations? For a time, the answer leaned toward caution. Incremental improvements were made instead. New versions of the Sherman were equipped with better guns, such as the 76mm, which offered improved performance against German armor. British forces introduced the Firefly, mounting a powerful 17-pounder gun onto the Sherman chassis. These changes helped, but they didn't fully close the gap. Meanwhile, German tank development continued to push forward. The Panther, with its sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm gun, added another layer of complexity to the battlefield. It was faster and in many ways more versatile than the Tiger, while still retaining deadly firepower. For Allied crews, this meant that the problem wasn't just one tank. It was an entire generation of enemy vehicles that outmatched them in key areas. By 1944, the pressure to respond had become impossible to ignore. Combat reports were clear. Field commanders were asking for something that could stand toe-to-toe with German heavy tanks, not just outmaneuver them or overwhelm them with numbers. They needed a tank that could fight on equal terms and win. And the result of that effort was a design that had been evolving quietly in the background. It would eventually become known as the M26 Pershing. Unlike the Sherman, it was built with a different philosophy in mind. It had thicker armor, a more powerful 90mm gun, and a silhouette that reflected lessons learned from years of combat. It was not just an upgrade, it was a shift. But getting that tank from design to battlefield was not immediate. There were delays in testing, disagreements over specifications, and ongoing concerns about reliability and production. Some commanders questioned whether it was necessary.
By early 1945, the war in Europe had reached a point where momentum was no longer in question. German forces were retreating on multiple fronts, their resources stretched thin, their experienced crews increasingly difficult to replace. And yet, in the world of armored warfare, one thing still remained dangerously consistent. German heavy tanks could still dominate a battlefield the moment they appeared. For American crews advancing into Germany, that reality had not changed. Even with improved tactics and upgraded Shermans, the threat of encountering a Tiger or Panther was enough to slow entire units. Every village, every crossroads, every patch of open ground carried the same question. If a German heavy tank was waiting, who would see it first, and who would survive the first shot? It was into this environment that a new machine finally arrived. When the first M26 Pershings reached Europe, they did not come in massive numbers. There was no overwhelming wave, no immediate shift in the balance of power. Instead, they appeared quietly, almost cautiously, assigned to select units for combat testing under real battlefield conditions. To the crews receiving them, however, the difference was immediately clear. The Pershing looked different, it felt different, and most importantly, it promised something that had been missing for years, the ability to fight back on equal terms. Its 90mm gun was the centerpiece of that promise.
Unlike the 75mm guns that had struggled against German armor, this weapon had the velocity and penetration needed to challenge even the most heavily protected enemy tanks. For the first time, American crews could engage at longer ranges without relying entirely on flanking maneuvers or numerical advantage. They could aim, fire, and expect results. But firepower alone was not enough. The Pershing also brought improved protection. Its frontal armor, while not invincible, was significantly stronger than that of the Sherman. It offered crews a level of survivability that changed how they approached combat. Instead of constantly maneuvering to avoid being hit, they could hold positions, trade shots, and stay in the fight longer. Inside the tank, the changes were just as important. Better optics allowed for clearer target identification. Improved ergonomics made it easier for crews to operate under pressure. These were not dramatic, headline-grabbing features, but in combat, they made a difference measured in seconds, and seconds often decided everything. The first crews to operate the Pershing quickly understood what they had been given. This was not just another variation of the Sherman, it was something entirely new. A tank designed not just to support infantry or exploit breakthroughs, but to confront the enemy's best machines directly. Still, on the other side of the battlefield, German tankers had no reason to be concerned, at least not at first. From their perspective, American armor had followed a predictable pattern for years. Shermans in various forms had been their primary opponents. They had learned how to fight them, how to defeat them, and how to exploit their weaknesses. A new tank, even if it was slightly heavier or better armed, did not immediately change that perception. When reports began to circulate about a different kind of American tank, many German crews dismissed them. Rumors were common in war, and not all of them proved true. Even when the first visual sightings occurred, the reaction was often cautious curiosity rather than alarm. It looked unfamiliar, yes, but unfamiliar did not necessarily mean dangerous. That assumption would not last long. In its early engagements, the Pershing did not seek to prove itself with dramatic, large-scale battles. Instead, it entered the fight in small numbers, facing the same conditions as every other tank: uncertain terrain, limited visibility, and an enemy that was both experienced and desperate. These were not controlled demonstrations. These were real encounters, where mistakes were punished instantly. And in those encounters, something began to change. American crews found that they no longer had to rely entirely on maneuver to survive. They could engage more directly, using the power of the 90mm gun to challenge German tanks at ranges that had previously been one-sided. Shots that would have been ineffective before now had a real chance of penetrating. Engagements that would have ended in seconds now lasted longer and sometimes ended differently. For German tankers, the shift was subtle at first. A shot that should have destroyed an American tank instead failed to penetrate. A return shot that should have been harmless instead struck with an unexpected force. These moments were easy to dismiss individually. In the chaos of battle, anomalies happen. But as they began to repeat, they became harder to ignore. The realization did not come all at once. It rarely does in war. Instead, it built gradually, through reports, observations, and the quiet recognition that something was no longer behaving as expected. The enemy was not reacting the same way. The usual advantages were not as decisive. For crews who had spent years operating under a clear set of assumptions, this was more than just a technical adjustment. It was a disruption of certainty. The Pershing did not make American forces invincible. It did not erase the experience and skill of German crews, nor did it eliminate the dangers of the battlefield. But it introduced something that had been missing: a balance. And balance, in a war that had long favored one side in armored engagements, was enough to change everything. Because once a fight becomes equal, it is no longer decided before it begins. For the first time since the Tiger had established its reputation, German tankers were facing an opponent that could meet them at range, withstand their fire, and respond with lethal force of its own. The outcome of an engagement was no longer guaranteed. It had to be fought for. and that was something they had not experienced in a long time. The arrival of the Pershing did not announce itself with a single decisive battle or a dramatic turning point. It revealed itself in moments, moments where expectations failed, where assumptions broke, and where the familiar rhythm of combat began to shift. Moments where a shot that should have ended the fight didn't. And in those moments, the confidence that had once defined German armored forces began, slowly, to crack.
The first time it happened, it didn't seem real. A German crew had done everything the way they always had. They had the position, the range, the advantage. The target, an American tank, was already in their sights. The gunner adjusted slightly, accounted for distance, and fired. The 88mm shell crossed the battlefield in an instant and struck the enemy vehicle. They waited for the familiar result: fire, smoke, a sudden stop. But instead, the tank was still there. Moments like that were easy to dismiss in isolation. Armor could deflect a shot at the right angle. A hit might land in a less critical area. These things happened. The crew reloaded, fired again, and expected the next round to finish the job. Sometimes it did. But sometimes, before they could fire again, the American tank responded. That was when the situation changed completely. The 90mm gun of the Pershing did not announce itself with a different sound or a visible warning. It didn't need to. What mattered was the effect. When its rounds struck German armor, they did not bounce harmlessly away. They hit with force, force that German crews were not used to receiving from American tanks at range. In several early encounters, the pattern became clear. Engagements that would once have been one-sided turned into exchanges. Instead of destroying the enemy before being detected, German tanks were now being engaged almost immediately after opening fire. The time between first shot and return fire, the margin that had defined their advantage, was shrinking. One of the most telling aspects of these encounters was distance. For years, German heavy tanks had relied on their ability to fight effectively at long range. Their guns could penetrate, their optics could identify targets, and their armor could withstand return fire. That combination allowed them to control engagements. Now, that control was slipping. Pershing crews could engage from distances that had previously been considered safe for German tanks. The battlefield no longer belonged to whoever fired first. It belonged to whoever fired accurately, and sometimes whoever fired second. In urban environments, the shift was even more dramatic. Cities and towns had always reduced the advantage of long-range firepower, forcing tanks into closer, more dangerous encounters. In these conditions, reaction time and armor protection became critical. Here, the Pershing proved something important. It could survive. Not every hit, not every time, but enough to matter. Enough to give its crew a chance to respond. And in close combat, that chance was everything. There were documented engagements where Pershings and German tanks encountered each other at short range, both sides aware of the danger, both sides trying to act first. In those moments, the outcome was no longer predetermined. A well-placed shot from either side could decide the fight. But for German crews, this equality was unfamiliar territory. They had been trained and had fought with the expectation that their machines would give them the upper hand. That expectation influenced every decision: when to engage, how long to hold position, when to withdraw. It was built on years of experience where their assumptions had proven correct. Now, those assumptions were being tested in real time. A tiger or panther that hesitated even for a second could now be destroyed. A position that once felt secure could now be exposed. The idea of being outmatched, even occasionally, introduced a level of uncertainty that had not been present before. For American crews, the change was just as significant, but in the opposite direction. Instead of approaching every engagement with caution and calculated risk, Pershing crews began to recognize that they had options. They could take positions that would have been too dangerous in a Sherman. They could engage targets that would have been avoided. They could fight, not just survive. This did not eliminate fear. Combat never does. But it changed the balance between fear and confidence. It gave crews a reason to believe that skill, timing, and decision-making could determine the outcome, not just the limitations of their equipment. And as these encounters became more frequent, the pattern spread. German after-action reports began to note the presence of heavier American tanks. Crews reported being engaged effectively at longer ranges. Instances of American tanks surviving initial hits became more common. None of these observations on their own seemed decisive, but together they pointed to a clear shift. The battlefield was no longer predictable. In some engagements, German tanks still held the advantage. Experience, positioning, and coordination continued to matter. But the certainty that once defined those advantages was gone. Every encounter carried a new question. Could this opponent fight back in a way that previous ones could not? And sometimes the answer was yes. There were brief, intense, and decisive moments where everything came down to a single exchange. Two tanks facing each other, both aware of what the other could do. In those moments, there was no doctrine, no overwhelming advantage, no guarantee. Just speed, accuracy, and the ability to act under pressure. For German tankers, these were the moments that stayed with them, not because they were common, but because they were different. They broke the pattern that had defined their experience of the war. The laughter that had once accompanied reports of American armor began to fade, replaced by something quieter. Not fear exactly, but caution, awareness, the recognition that the battlefield had changed in a way that could not be ignored. Because once an opponent proves they can defeat you, even once, the illusion of invincibility is gone. And without that illusion, every engagement becomes something else entirely. A risk.
At first, no one said it out loud. German tank crews didn't suddenly lose their skill, their discipline, or their ability to fight. The machines they operated, the Tigers and Panthers, were still powerful, still dangerous, still capable of destroying enemy armor in the right conditions. On paper, very little had changed. But on the battlefield, something had. It wasn't just about a new American tank appearing in small numbers. It was about what that tank represented. For years, German armored forces had operated with a kind of unspoken certainty. They believed that in a direct engagement, they held the advantage. That belief shaped how they moved, how they chose positions, and how they reacted under pressure. Now, that certainty was gone. The change didn't happen in a single battle. It didn't come from one dramatic defeat or a sudden collapse. It came slowly, through repeated encounters where the expected outcome failed to materialize. A shot that didn't destroy its target, an enemy tank that returned fire from a distance that should have been safe, a position that no longer felt secure. Each moment on its own was small, but together they added up to something much larger. Doubt. In armored warfare, doubt is as dangerous as any weapon. It creeps into decisions, slows reactions, and forces crews to question what they once took for granted. A commander who hesitates, even briefly, can lose the initiative. A gunner who second-guesses a shot may lose the opportunity to fire first. For German tankers who had spent years building confidence through success, this shift was deeply unsettling. They began to approach engagements differently. Positions that once felt dominant were now evaluated with more caution. Open ground, once an advantage for long-range fire, became a potential risk. The idea that an enemy tank could survive the first shot and respond effectively changed the rhythm of combat. It forced a new kind of thinking. At the same time, the broader situation of the war was closing in around them. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Replacement crews lacked the experience of the veterans they were replacing. Air superiority increasingly belonged to the Allies, making movement during daylight dangerous.
Even the most powerful tank is only as effective as the conditions in which it operates, and those conditions were deteriorating. In this environment, the psychological edge that German armored units had relied on became even more important, and its loss even more damaging. Because for years, that edge had compensated for other weaknesses. It had allowed smaller forces to hold off larger ones. It had enabled aggressive tactics that depended on confidence and speed. It had turned technical superiority into battlefield dominance. Without it, everything became harder. For American forces, the effect was the opposite. The arrival of the Pershing did not instantly transform every engagement, but it changed the way crews thought about the fight. It gave them a tool that matched the enemy's strengths, not just worked around them. And with that came a shift in mindset. Confidence began to grow, not from theory, but from experience. Crews who had once been forced to rely on coordination and numbers now found that they could engage more directly. They could hold ground, challenge enemy positions, and fight with a level of assurance that had previously been missing. The balance between caution and aggression began to shift, and that shift had consequences. Because war is not just a contest of machines, but of adaptation. The side that learns faster, adjusts more effectively, and applies those lessons under pressure gains the advantage. For much of the war, German armored forces had held that advantage. They had introduced new designs, refined their tactics, and exploited weaknesses in their opponents. Now, that process was working against them. The Allies had learned. They had studied the battlefield, analyzed their losses, and responded, not just with new tactics, but with new technology. The Pershing was the result of that process, but it was also a symbol of something larger. It showed that the gap could be closed, that no advantage, no matter how dominant, was permanent. For German crews, this realization came too late to change the outcome of the war, but not too late to be felt. In the final months of the conflict, every engagement carried a different weight. The confidence that had once defined their approach was replaced by a more cautious, measured mindset. They still fought, still resisted, still used every advantage they had, but the sense of inevitability was gone. Victory was no longer assumed. It had to be earned, and even then, it was uncertain. And in that uncertainty, the illusion that had sustained them for so long finally collapsed. Not because the Tiger had become obsolete overnight, not because the Pershing was invincible, but because the balance had shifted just enough to expose a truth that had always been there. No machine, no matter how powerful, can guarantee victory once the enemy learns how to fight it. In the end, that was the real turning point. Not a single battle, not a single shot, but the moment when belief gave way to reality, when the crews inside those steel machines realized that they were no longer untouchable. And once that realization took hold, it changed everything that followed.